Hi, welcome back to educator.com. This lesson covers the use of XSLT to display XML data visually. Since XML makes a good database platform but lacks any native visual component, it would be useful to be able to plug XML data into another, more visual document type. In this lesson, we'll take a look at the different varieties of the XSL or XML style sheet language. We'll take a look at how that contrasts with the style sheet language we've looked at before in this course called CSS. And we'll take a look at an example of an XSL transformation. XSLT provides for visual display of XML data by placing the contents of XML elements into elements of another XML document type that's more visually oriented, such as XHTML. First, let's get all of these various languages straight. XSL stands for XML Style Sheet Language. It comes in two different varieties. One is called XSL-FO, and the FO stands for Format Object. This is somewhat like CSS in that we take each part of the document and give a very detailed description of how it should appear visually in a variety of media. It's actually not that widely used except in certain professional situations. The most wide use of it is to take an XML document and turn it into an Adobe PDF type file. The one we'll be taking a look at today is XSLT, and the T stands for transform. What we're doing here is we're creating a template in another XML document type and plugging our XML data into it. Now that we're clear which XML language we're talking about, let's compare it with another styling language that we've seen before. Let's take a look at XSLT versus CSS. And what we'll do is we'll take a look at a couple of files here. Here's our message1.xml file. It's a pretty basic file of the message type that we've used before in the course. It has a from element, a to element, a message text element, and a sig element. In this case, the signature just contains text. Other versions that we've done haven't. And up here, we're using an XML style sheet declaration or processing instruction to say that we're bringing in a text file written in CSS that's located in a file called messagestyle.css. And if we take a look at messagestyle.css, which is also included, it's pretty basic formatting. I want everything to appear on its own line by using the block display property. And I'm setting text style for each of my individual elements so they look a little bit different from each other and appear in slightly different portions of the screen. And this way, by combining my message.xml file, message1.xml, with the messagestyle.css file, if I then go to my browser, it looks like this. Okay? Each element is on its own line, and each has its own slightly different style. And this is what we've seen before in terms of styling with XML and CSS. And one thing we notice is that CSS has a completely different syntax than XML. This is because CSS was originally designed for the HTML language, and CSS, if you're familiar with web design, can be used interspersed with your HTML. So in order to make that easy to program for, they wanted CSS to be in a completely different appearance so that as your browser processed through the file and it found some CSS data, it realized, hey, I'm not in XML land anymore. I'm not in HTML land anymore. However, including text that isn't XML in an XML document is actually kind of a tricky ordeal, and it actually makes things more difficult. So that creates the desire for an XML-based style language so that your XML processor can handle everything. All right. Also included is a file called message2. This is the exact same content as the message1.xml file. The only difference is that its style sheet processing instruction is pulling in a text file written in XSL, and it's in a file called messagetemplate.xsl. Let's take a brief look at that file. And without getting too deep into what we're looking at here, we see this actually has a lot of web page type stuff in it. But it is an XML file up here. And we see that some of the elements within the page have these strange XSL qualified name prefixes. All right, we see that here and here and in a couple other places. So XSL is very much an HTML or an XML language, but it's in XML syntax, and that allows your XML processor to have an easier time sorting it all out. You can use namespaces to distinguish when you're in your XML file and when you're working with XSL. Also, CSS is more of an identifying language, whereas XSL has a little bit more capability to it. You can actually do minor programming in XSL, so it contains a certain amount of intelligence, and that can be key in using your XML data in another format. So let's see XSLT at work by taking some XML data and plugging it into an HTML web page. You'll find a file called addresspage.html, and this is an ordinary HTML file. We're actually not going to be using it other than just to look at it and see what it is. All right, it's a basic web page. It's got a table in it, and we've included a caption for our table and some headers here for name, address, phone, and email. All right, and each of these is going to be part of a database of, let's say, an address book that we have or a contact list. And what we're going to do is we're going to be creating extra rows of the table to contain individual records from an XML database. The first step is to create an XSL template. And you'll find a file called addresstemplate.xsl to follow along with. And if you look closely, it's the exact same file, but it's got a whole lot of stuff surrounding it. Let's take a look at what we've done here. First of all, we've given it an XML declaration just to make sure we're very clear here. The first element is called XSL style sheet, or really it's just the style sheet element, but it includes the XSL namespace prefix, which we declare right here. Now, if you watched our namespace lesson, you learned that namespaces can be just about anything. So technically, we could call our XSL prefix anything we want to. We could call it Fred, we could call it style, we could call it what we want to, if we believe that any browser that's going to accompany it is a perfectly conformant XML processor and doesn't expect to see the XSL prefix with XSL elements. You can't always count on that, so it's probably a good idea to always declare XSL to have this prefix, XSL. And here's the namespace for that. And then our first actual element, our root level element, is style sheet, but then the next one under that is template. And the template element has to have a match attribute, and the match attribute is a slash. Now, what exactly is this? Well, let's take a moment and see what's going on here. We locate specific elements within an XML file for XSL style sheet processing using something called XPath. Yes, they came up with a whole lot of X names in the late 90s. It was the late 90s, what can I tell you? The root element, such as we might see written in XML this way, in XPath is referred to as a slash. The slash refers to the document root. So when I say I'm matching my template to that slash, it means I'm matching it to the document root. I'm going to find my XML elements relative to the top of the document. You can actually specify a different part of the document using XPath, but we're going to keep things pretty simple right here. So if referring specifically to the root element, it's slash root element. If I want to find, let's say, element NE2, nested element 2, which is inside nested element 1, which is inside my root element, the XPath for that would be these slashes with each element name listed consecutively. Anytime I use part of an XPath and then I need to find something inside that node, as it's called, I only need to refer to the rest of the path. I don't need to go back and refer to the whole string. And we'll take a look at how that works here. If we go back to our XML file, or XSL file, I should say. All right, so in my template, what my template is basically a very large text string that contains information that I want spat out to the application. So it's going to spit out an HTML element, a head element, and that enables my browser to process it as a normal web page. And everything looks pretty normal. It looks very HTML and web pagey until we get to the end of the first row. Then I've got something here called XSL for each. XSL for each allows us to create a portion of our template that can be repeated depending on how many different XML nodes I need to process through. So its format is like this. I use my prefix. The element is called for each with a hyphen there. I need a select attribute, and the value of the select attribute is a relative XPath. All right, and then I always want to make sure to include the end tag. It's very easy when we're getting into complex file names like this with the prefixes to forget our end tags, so it's important not to forget. So what we've got here in our for each element, and this is a long element. In fact, let me highlight this here so we can see just what we're dealing with. What I'm saying is that within my root element, which is where my template matches, I'm saying for each contact element in an element called contact list, I want to include all of this. Okay, and we see that some of this looks like HTML. We've got our TR and our TD. But then we've got some more XSL elements that we need to deal with. So let's take a look at those. The XSL value of element is where I actually pull my XML data into my template. And it looks somewhat like for each. I use my prefix. The name of the element is value of. It also has a select attribute. And again, I'm using a relative XPath to locate the information that I need. Getting back to our template here. So for each contact, and contact is basically going to be my record in my contact list, I want to create a table row. I want to create a data element, and in it, I want to include the value of an element within my contact record called first name. Then I would like a space. This is a Unicode character entity. If you looked at our XML structure lesson, you know what a character entity is. This is simply a space. And then I include the value of an element called last name. And then my data element ends. I'm going to include another data element. This one's going to include a value of an element called house num, followed by a space, followed by the value of an element called street, followed by a line break. And then on the next line, I'm going to include city, state, and zip, all using this XSL value of element. Then my data element ends. The next data piece includes my area code and phone number, appropriately spaced. And then my last one's going to include email. And then that's going to be the end of the row. And here's the end of my XSL for each element. So basically I'm saying for each contact record in my database, I want you to spit out a table row that includes all this information. So rather than having to worry about using CSS to style each different element and place it exactly on the screen, I'm just going to generate a web page and plug in my XML data. We can see this in action with a file called contact list 1. Here is the file contact list 1. My root element is contact list, and then I have a bunch of contact elements, which are basically my database records. And then each one has a great deal of information. I've broken out the area code away from the rest of the phone number in case I need to group those together. I've broken out the street name in case I need to group that together without the number. Each record includes a lot of detailed elements with specific information. Now, I only have 2 records here. And up at the top, I've got an XML style sheet processing instruction. And I'm going to use this address template.xsl file that we've been taking a look at. So if I load this into my browser, I see that I've created a table row for every single one of these records. Here's John Sender, my first record here. And then the next one is Trixie Recipient. And this enables me to place my XML data in an easily readable format. Most people are used to reading tables on an HTML page, so I can take this complex data that's organized well for computer sorting, and I can put it in a much more readable format without too much effort. I create a web page to put it in, I put my XSL template information in there, and it goes to work for me. Now, I may encounter some trouble if I have a lot of elements. Here is another file, contactlist2.xml, and it's the exact same file as contactlist1, except it has a couple of extra records. And if I look at that one in the browser, I see that my table is starting to get a little long. And the longer bits of information are, the harder it can be to find things. Now, I've simulated the creation of this file, assuming that as records get added, and they might get added in any order, they're just kind of appended to the end. They're not in any particular order. And let's say that whatever is creating this XML database is not bothering to sort the information as it's entered. Not necessarily the best way to do things, by the way. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to be able to sort this information, let's say by last name, so that it's easier for me to see. Unfortunately, XSL provides a means to do that. I'm going to go back to my address template.xsl file, and right in the middle here, I see an element called XSL sort. However, I've enclosed it in these items here. This is an XML comment. If you programmed in HTML, you might have seen these before. And if you're new to computer programming, a comment is something where you put a piece of text that's not meant to be processed by the computer. It's usually there to provide information to any humans who might be reading the source code. In fact, at the top of address-template.xsl, I've included a comment, such as you typically see in a computer program code, where I'm simply describing for anybody who's reading exactly what follows so that they don't have to parse through the code themselves and figure it out. So this template takes an XML contact list and places its entries in an HTML table. One handy thing you can do with a comment is if there's any code that you'd like not to work, you can enclose it in a comment and the computer will not work with it. So your address template.xsl file includes a sort element that has been disabled by comments. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to get rid of these comment tags, and this will activate my XSL sort element. Let's take a look for a moment at what that is. We saw that our contactlist.xml file had a lot of different records in it, and we'd like them to be sorted. In our contactlist2 XML file, we saw that we had a lot of records and we'd like to be able to sort them. So what this XSL sort element will do, it looks very much similar in syntax to the other XSL elements we've seen. It's going to find the last name element, and it's going to take all the XML elements that we're using in the template, and it's going to sort them on that field. So now that I've deleted my comments and saved this file, if I reload my page here in the browser, it will process with the new saved file with the sort elements. And now my first column is sorted according to last name. So XSLT can use a standard web page template and dynamically generate the proper HTML code on the fly. So in this lesson, we learned that XSL can be used to create templates of other document types. We learned that XSLT uses a language called XPath to indicate different parts of a heavily nested XML document. And we saw that XSLT intelligently selects and organizes the content of an XML file for inclusion in the new document, generating code in the new document as appropriate. Thank you for visiting educator.com.